So we're going to talk about the Cuyahoga River. Now, just kind of curious, last week the last speaker had a passing reference to the Cuyahoga. I just wondered by show of hands how many people have heard of the Cuyahoga River before this presentation. Hokey smokes, that's a lot. Well, I'm done.
How many have been?
Yeah.
Not as many.
Yeah, not that many. Oh, that's excellent. Now, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great, thanks. So, first thing we have to do is do a little geography lesson, and where in the heck is the Cuyahoga River? Well, the Cuyahoga is in northeastern Ohio, and so the Cuyahoga starts northeast of Cleveland, even though Cleveland's on the south shore of Lake Erie, flows south, hits into Akron before it goes into Cleveland and flows into Lake Erie. For kind of comparison, it is very, very similar to the Nooksack. It has almost exactly the same square area. It has almost exactly the same length of the main stems and the tributaries. And it was created about the same time after the last ice age. So actually pretty similar. The one thing that's a little bit different, however, is using this shaded relief map, is you'll notice the absence of mountains. It's pretty, in fact, they called me Flatlander when I first came here. But one of the things that that results in is that the Cuyahoga River has 1/4 the flow, average annual flow, than the Nooksack River. So it has a lot less water in it than the Nooksack. But otherwise, it's pretty similar. The other thing that's different is that the Cuyahoga sits on the Continental Divide. And that, you'll find out later, is really important. Anything in the Cuyahoga River flows north up into Lake Erie, over Niagara Falls, into Lake Ontario, and out the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Atlantic. If it goes just a little bit south, that little squiggly blue line there below the Continental Divide is the Tuscarawas River. And if you get on that river system, that'll take you down to the Ohio, to the Mississippi, and out through New Orleans to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, why is that important? Well, back in the time when the Egyptians were building the pyramids, the Adena and the Hopewell cultures were building these mounds, ceremonial mounds. And this is some of the mounds that are in the Cuyahoga River Basin. This happens to be Towner's Woods Mound in Pippin Lake. And the thing that's really interesting about this is that these are some of the artifacts that were dug up out of these mounds. Does anybody kind of get an idea what those figurines and those artifacts look like? Exactly. It looks an awful lot like the Mayan culture down in Central America. And that's pretty astounding, because that's 2,000 miles in the Gulf of Mexico between these mound builders and the cultures that are down in Central America. So why in the world was it that way? It was because this was a known travel route. And so there was lots of trade and travel going through the Cuyahoga River and the Tuscarawas River. And it was so important, as a matter of fact, that the two great nations that are in this area use that as the boundary line between their nations. On the western side was the Huron or the Wyandots, and on the eastern side it was the Iroquois League of Nations, which were 7 different cultures that combined together to form the Iroquois nation. And after the Greenville Treaty, which is depicted here with the signatures from the Iroquois, that was actually the western boundary of the United States at the time. So again, that just shows the importance of this water route, trade route, for both the Native Americans and for the early U.S. nation. Getting back to this shaded relief map, when the first settlers came into the area, they went ahead and developed Cleveland. They primarily came through Lake Erie and settled there in Cleveland. And then some overland settlers came in. And one of the great stories I like to read, or I have read, is this one settler came to the rim of the Cuyahoga River, and he stood up there and he listened, and he thought, my gosh, there's a great waterfall there. And he just got all excited, because waterfall meant water power, which meant that they could put up this great industrial machinery there to go ahead and power stuff. So he got all excited and he started running down into the valley and everything, and he got to the river and there was no waterfall. What it was, there were so many sturgeon spawning in the river, it made such a splashing noise that he thought it was a waterfall. That's how many fish there were. And there's reports of people just throwing spears into the water and catching fish because there were so many. I assume that was because it was spring runs coming from Lake Erie. But unfortunately, this is to be repeated over and over again, is when the white man or the European settlers came in, they kind of despoiled the whole natural system. And the days of those huge sturgeon and runs of fish coming up Lake Erie were no more, especially after the Erie Canal was built. And before then, Cleveland was just a wee little village. It really wasn't anything more than a village. But when the Erie Canal opened up, they were able to take their goods to Buffalo, to Albany, and down to New York City. And it really made the city boom. Later on, Summit County and Summit Lake dug a canal between the Cuyahoga and the Tuscarawas. And instead of having to get into a canoe and portage it over this land, they put in this canal and you could just sit in a boat and go from Lake Erie down to New Orleans without ever having to step foot on ground. And this really made a big difference between Cleveland and Akron. This really built it up. And then after that, they built the Pennsylvania and Ohio Canal, and this connected Cleveland with Pittsburgh. And again, just industrial and more commerce that came in with all these different transportation routes. And so the Cuyahoga River was sitting right in the middle of this great transportation route. And to the south and to the east, the coal fields of Appalachia. Just immediately east of there, it was Titusville and the first oil wells that were drilled in the United States, actually in the world. To the west is the limestone quarries, and even further west were iron ore production, or mines. And so Cleveland was right in the middle of this great transportation route. It was right in the middle of this great natural resources in the area, and it just made for a great place. In fact, the tagline for Cleveland at one time was best location in the nation, and it really was true. So you've got this transportation route in the middle of all this industrial natural resources, and as a result you had just an influx of all sorts of industries coming in there, and this really was the start of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. In Akron, there were 6 rubber companies, including Goodyear, Firestone, General Tire, Cyberling Tire. And again, this is all in the small city of Akron on a little stream, so just a little bit of pollution and it really messed it up. And then down in Cleveland, there were at least 5 or 6, I think there were 5 integrated steel mills. And at one time, it was the largest steel production area in the world. And above and beyond that, have you ever heard of John D. Rockefeller? John D. Rockefeller got his start in Cleveland. And at one time, again, he had more than 90% of the oil refining capacity in the whole world. He had a monopoly on it. And they had to break him up, and then his company, Standard Oil, was broken up into a lot of different companies, including Exxon and Amoco and Standard Oil, which became BP. And so it was a huge, huge thing. There's also Alcoa Aluminum on there, Dow DuPont. There was just an amazing industrial complex down there. And as you can see, there wasn't an awful lot of natural areas left when these industries came in here. Essentially, the river was sacrificed to the name of the Industrial Revolution. And pollution abounded. And where there's people, there's trash. Just some unsightly things going on. And of course, when people had other trash they went to throw away, where did they put it? They didn't put it in nice agricultural areas. They put it down into the quote-unquote worthless land. Marshes and riparian areas that flooded all the time. And so you had things like this all the time with storm sewers going right through the middle of a garbage dump that get eroded out from the river. And it was quite a mess. Excuse me. In the early 1960s, a photographer for Time magazine often was flying between Chicago and New York, and he often flew over Cleveland, and he'd look down and he'd see this polluted mess, and he always wanted to go down there and take a look at it. So a couple of times he went ahead and started doing his own photographs of the area on his own. It wasn't an assignment or anything. He just thought it was very interesting. So he went ahead and we got a hold of some of his photos. It took us like 2 or 3 years in negotiation to let us use some of his photos. This is one here. Take a look at the tugboats there and kind of just keep in the back of your mind. You'll see them later. There were all sorts of discharges. This was one we affectionately called Old Blackie. It was from a coking operation for Republic Steel. And this one we have no idea, this predated me, what exactly this discharge was, but it was in the area of Standard Oil's research and development laboratory, as well as DuPont's discharges. So I'm sure it wasn't a real pleasant discharge. And just another idea of some of the industrial areas down in what we call the flats down there. And again, take a look at those twin railroad bridges. You'll see those a little bit later. And at first I thought this must have been the 1930s or 40s because, I mean, there were just no pollution controls here whatsoever. The steel mills were really cranking out, and I thought it was for the war production. But I see in the top left-hand corner, you see the Air Review building. That was in the mid-60s, so that's pretty much what dates this photograph. And it's still just kind of remarkable that the river was really that bad. So does Dante's Inferno kind of come to mind? Not exactly a pleasant place to live. And there was so much air pollution as well as water pollution that the whole area was a dirty brown orange from the air pollution from primarily the steel mills. And everything was covered that way. When I was a kid, I remember my dad taking me up to the Indians for a ball game. And the last 10 or 15 miles would be through this. It was like almost like the Wizard of Oz, you know, when they were in Kansas, it was black and white, only this one was orange and brown. And it was just really kind of depressing. And as soon as I got to the ball game, we walked through the tunnel and you opened it up and there was this emerald green field. It was just so brilliant compared to what was outside. It really made an impression on me. The other thing that was kind of neat is as I was going up against a small kid, it was neat. There was a road along the old canal system called the Canal Road. And there was a small mill there that had a mill dam, and the water flew over that, and it was turbulent and everything. And there was so much detergent in the stream that you would get these billows of suds that were 15, 20 foot tall, and the wind would blow them over the road, and you just had to wait there until it cleared so you could see again. That's just pretty disgusting, but as a kid, it was kind of pretty neat. How long did it take you guys to realize that the river was running through the bottom of this photograph? It is hard. And as with any industrial area, there's all sorts of hazardous waste. And these were just kept outside because it was just expedient. And of course, they leaked. And when they leaked, where do they go? They go to the lowest elevation on the property, which ends up in the river. And we had our Superfund sites. This happens to be the Kredgy dump that I worked on. And thousands and thousands of barrels that we had to overpack and properly dispose of, and hundreds of yards of contaminated soil that had to be disposed. And then again, as an industrial area, you have all sorts of industrial accidents you have no control over. And I don't know if you can notice, but where that tanker split, all of the ballast underneath the railroad tracks, there was so much material that flew out of there that it just basically washed out the ballast. And again, went right to the river. But of course, the Cuyahoga River is known for catching on fire. And this is some graffiti that's on one of the bridges down in the flats. And as a result, there were just all sorts of jokes about the Cuyahoga River. And so every once in a while, you'd see a flammable sign posted on the Cuyahoga River. And to this day, there's still jokes made about it. There was some kid that had gotten an infection from bacteria from wading in the river. And this was the political cartoon that ran in the Beacon Journal. So, shout out your answers. When did the Cuyahoga River catch fire? 69. Yeah, you guys, you got caught. 69, and that's one of the reasons I did the presentation. 69 was the last, and hopefully last ever, and most infamous fire was in 1969. One of the reasons I did the presentation, because this is the 50th year anniversary of the fire. So, you guys stole my thunder. All of the above. So this is the 1936 fire, and we don't have any photographs prior to this. The reason we have photographs of this one is that it lasted 5 days. And it's not an insignificant fire. This is the 1949 fire, and one of the early fire tugs that were commissioned almost exclusively for the Cuyahoga River because it caught on fire so frequently. They had to have a fireboat to help try to put it out. Another one in 1951. And 1952, this is not the 1969 fire. There really was never a picture of the Cuyahoga on fire during the 1969 fire because they put it out before anybody got down there to get a photograph of it. So the reporter just went ahead and found some old file photographs and put that on there and said this is the 1969 fire. So it's kind of, yeah, kind of funny. But remember I told you to remember the tugboats? Well, here's the tugboats that had caught on fire down at Kingsbury Run. So those are the same exact tugboats that George Levins had photographed. And you can just go on and on and on. Pretty remarkable. So my professors at Kent State University before I got there, they were students of Eugene Odom. And Eugene Odom was one of the guys that popularized ecological systems and really kind of was the father of the study of ecology. And in order to kind of entice him to come up there, the professors went ahead and had this study of the ecosystem of the Cuyahoga River prior to him coming up there, and they did a complete survey from the headwaters all the way down to the mouth. And I just love this portion of one of the station descriptions down on the flats, and that they said animal life does not exist. Only the algae oscillatoria grows on the piers above the water line. This entire reach is grossly polluted. Duh, do you think? So here we come to the 1969 fire.
Cleveland, even now I can remember, 'cause the Cuyahoga River goes smoking through my dreams. Burn on, big river, burn on. Burn on, big river, burn on. Now the Lord can make you tumble, the Lord can make you turn, the Lord can make you overflow, but the Lord can't make you burn. Burn on, big river, burn on. Burn on, big river, burn on.
A rendition of Randy Newman's Burn On, which is a song that he made famous about the burning Cuyahoga River. And also a newspaper or a news report of the fire aftermath, showing the trestle was all charred and the railroad tracks had all melted and were twisted and everything. Unfortunately, we weren't able to see that. So the reason for the fire is this. These are oil slicks that are down in the Cuyahoga River. Remember the twin railroad bridges I mentioned to you earlier? Well, these are them again. The only difference between this and what happened in 1969 in June is that back then they had an awful lot of woody debris that had came from upstream and got caught underneath the bridge. And so that kind of acted like a floating candle. And so you have this floating candle sitting right there underneath the bridge. And then the bridge is used to take molten iron from one steel mill over to the mill on the other side. And so they pour molten iron into these cars that are called torpedo or bullet cars. And that didn't look too bad, except this is what they look like when they're full of the molten iron. So there's sparks spewing out all over the place. And when they went over the river, these sparks came out there. They hit the oil, woody debris, and caught on fire. And this is the Twitter equivalent of Twitter back in 1969. This is the Associated Press report on the Cuyahoga River. And you can see that there is no flames or anything because no reporter got out there until after the fire was over. It was such a blasé event for the community and that the notice of the fire was put on page 11C of the Plain Dealer. That's like way, way, way back. And it didn't have a reporter's byline on it. It was just like kind of a small news blurb. Nobody paid much attention to it. Well, Time magazine went ahead and did a piece on the effects of cities and what the cities have done in order to grow and be prosperous, and that they basically have trashed the environment. And they put this in the edit of the same edition where Chappaquiddick and Ted Kennedy was really the big piece. And so it was kind of forgotten, and nobody really learned too much about it, heard too much about it. Excuse me. But there were some really colorful descriptions of the river. What's really sad, and a lot of people don't realize, is that the piece was actually a positive piece about Cleveland, because Cleveland recognized that they had a polluted river on their hands, and that they went ahead and self-imposed a bond of $100 million to go ahead and clean up the river. Now, today's $100 million didn't sound that much, but back in the day, that was almost as much money as the entire nation had available for spending on cleanup of waterways. So it was a pretty significant investment, the city of Cleveland. But that isn't really what captured the attention. It was the description of the river and how bad it was. It wasn't that Cleveland was doing something about it, it's that the river was so bad. So the Santa Barbara oil spill happened just before the Cuyahoga River did. And when that happened, Congress went ahead and passed the National Environmental Policy Act, and passed the House flying colors, and it was languishing in the Senate, and there really wasn't an awful lot going on. Then the Cuyahoga River caught fire. And immediately after Congress came back into session, the Time magazine article was used as a reason for why they needed to pass the National Environmental Policy Act. And when they voted on it, it was a unanimous decision. There was no dissent. And that was both Republicans and Democrats, you know that, yeah. And then shortly after that, Gaylord Nelson is a person that started Earth Day. And he used the Cuyahoga River as his motivating factor for going ahead and starting Earth Day. And that's why the Earth Day that's coming up is the 49th Earth Day. So next year will be the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And as a result of the river, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency was created. You can see it was just a year after the fire, and that's just light speed when you start talking about things moving through Congress. And it was signed by Richard Nixon. And the legacy keeps going on and on. When Bill Clinton was elected president, he wanted to start a program that recognized the importance of rivers in the United States development. And so he developed this program called the American Heritage Rivers Program. And everybody who thought they had a significant river was to go ahead and come up with a spiel as to why they thought their river deserved recognition. And it was going to be reviewed by a bunch of experts, and then submitted for the president's approval, and it was going to be limited to 10 rivers. So they went through this process, and they gave them to Bill Clinton, and Clinton looked at it, and he goes, "Where's the Cuyahoga? Didn't they apply, or what's going on?" And they said, "Well, they didn't quite make the cut. We thought they were more deserving." And he says, No. He says, "The Cuyahoga River is all about, or the American Heritage River System program is all about the Cuyahoga River." But by far, the most important regulatory fruit that came out of the fire is Public Law 92-500, which is the Clean Water Act, which amended the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, which basically was a toothless act that had very little impact on improving water quality. This and the Clean Air Act are probably, arguably, the most important environmental regulations our nation have ever passed. And I just love this as the opening sentence on the act. The objective of this act is to restore and maintain the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. So, how do you do that? First of all, you monitor the heck out of things. So these are the Ohio EPA monitoring locations on the Cuyahoga River watershed. And you can see there's quite a few. Most people, when they go ahead and start looking at water quality, and I'm sorry, Wayne, I'm going to be getting into your face a little bit. The easy approach was to to go ahead and take some organisms, throw them in some water, throw in some pollutants and see if they die or not. If that concentration that kills 50% of them, they'll then go ahead and take a safety factor, usually an order of magnitude, to go ahead and take care of sensitive organisms and use that as a number that if you meet this number, then everything's just hunky-dory. And that's an easy way to do things. And when the agency was first, the US EPA was first implemented, it was implemented by healthcare professionals and engineers. So they were looking, there were very few biologists. They were always looking at numbers. And so they were very comfortable with that approach. So just about every state in the nation and around the world use this as the first approach to try to go ahead and clean up our nation's waterways. And we affectionately call them bucket tossers. Now, since I'm in an academic situation, we have to have a graph. I'd be thrown out if we didn't have graphs. And this in 1991 was just the epitome of computer graphics, blocky text and all. But this shows the physical improvement that the Cuyahoga River has made from 1950s up until 1991. And you can see that at many times during the 1950s there was no oxygen in the river whatsoever. In 1991, basically we're meeting water quality standards throughout the entire reach of the river. Phosphorus and ammonia, and again, not to belabor the point, but just dramatic improvements. And if you know anything about water chemistry and natural systems, phosphorus at 3 and ammonia at 4 is just ridiculous. And if you want to make people think you're really smart, you have a graph that has box and whisker plots. So this is a compilation of samples that were collected below the Southerly wastewater treatment plant. And again, these are not effluent samples. These are samples that came from the river itself. Ammonia concentration 6 and 7 milligrams per liter is mind-boggling. Well, Ohio EPA did a little bit different approach. Sure, we did a lot of indicators that identify stressors, such as monthly operating reports. In other words, dischargers went out and sampled the effluent and came up with chemical numbers and then decided whether or not that was good or bad. We looked at fish kills, we looked at spills, habitats somewhat, and land use. And you go out and you take samples and you determine the exposure of the animals in these samples that you collect that I mentioned earlier. However, nobody really went out and evaluated the actual response. So if you want to look at whether or not it's fishable, swimmable, why don't you go out and sample the fish? It's like, duh. So that's what Ohio EPA did. And it's very difficult to do. As a matter of fact, Ohio is almost unique in the nation when it comes up to having numerical water quality standards and incorporate biology. They went ahead and introduced a lot of different indices. I'll get into that a little bit. But we also got into an awful lot of computer modeling. This is Mary Ann setting out a sediment oxygen demand chamber in use of support of HEC-RAS and Qual2E models to kind of help us indicate what type of concentrations we want to have in dischargers so they wouldn't negatively impact the river. And this is where Ohio EPA really shines. These are bug pickers, and their job is to go out in the summertime, put out these Hestrodendae artificial substrate samplers, or insect hotels, if you will, and go out and look under rocks and pick up all these bugs and take them back to the laboratory and take a look at them. They went ahead and did this and came up with an index called the Invertebrate Community Index to make a determination as to what the water quality is of the river. And these guys got just amazingly good. They could take a look at a set of organisms from a specific sampling site, and they could tell just based upon the organisms whether or not there was too much dissolved solids, too much chromium, specific metals. It was just amazing. In fact, some of the guys had a relationship with the Smithsonian Institution. Whenever Smithsonian had some organisms they wanted identified, an awful lot of times they would send them to our guys to go ahead and take a look at it. So they were top notch. At one time I thought I wanted to be one of these guys, but in the summertime it's fun. In the wintertime, in order to get down to the lowest taxonomic unit, you have to look at the insect genitalia. And I just didn't see myself looking at insect gonads all winter long. So I decided that's not for me. And then there's the fish kickers. And these guys go out and put in pulse DC current into the water to stun the fish. So they float to the surface, you net them, put them into a live well, and you count them, look for anomalies, weigh them so you get a biomass, identify them, things like that. And again, they came up with different indices. They got two indices based on the fish. It's the index of biotic integrity and the index of well-being. And then of course, we also looked at fish kills. If you notice at the date, this was in 2003. So you say, Steve, what happened? You know, this is supposed to be a good story. Everything's getting better. Why about the fish kill in 2003? Well, remember the canal that came up from the Ohio River? This is called unintended consequences. When they built the canal, it made a pathway for these Ohio River fish to come up into Lake Erie. And these Ohio River drainage fish aren't used to the cold. And so when it goes through a very quick cool down or warm up cycle, the fish can't tolerate, they don't know what's going on, and they go into autolysis. They actually start eating their nervous system tissue, and so they die. And an especially bad winter, more than 90% of the gizzard shad, which have this problem, die as a result of that. So although this looks bad, it's actually a natural phenomenon. This isn't so natural. This is one of the things that we look at when we go ahead and do the fish shocking is for what we call delts. Deformities, eroded fins, lesions, and tumors. And this obviously is a deformed carp. And the mandible in this northern pike, I don't understand how he was able to grow that large a size with a deformed mandible like that. And all sorts of tumors, especially bottom-dwelling fish. The bullheads on the left, you see the black spots, those are all melanomas. So what's up with the river now? Well, best example of an urban river's recovery is in Cleveland. And hopefully I can show you that this is actually true. Remember I told you about the fish indices? This is the IBI scores down in the flats, the top one in the orange circles. And if you basically have a fish, it's a 12. And so you can see that back in the 1980s, there basically it was just a very, very poor fishery. But you get back up into the 2000s, and we're basically meeting the general use designation for that stream. And at Hillside, which is between Akron and Cleveland, we're actually in the exceptional range. There's no difference between the Hillside site and our least impacted reference sites. So those are some of the fish that are found in the Cuyahoga River nowadays. Real sensitive species like the darters and river chubs. And there's 84 species that have been collected in the Cuyahoga River since the 1970s. To put this in perspective, the entire state of Washington only has 60-some species of fish for the whole state. So that's quite a remarkable record. Well, and while this is up, this is kind of like a public service announcement for you guys. If there's anybody who is a freshwater ecologist and you're looking for a thesis, the Ohio EPA has a database that is just phenomenal. It's a comprehensive database of macroinvertebrates, fish, some periphyton, water chemistry. It's an amazing database. And it's a gold mine if you want to mine it for your master's thesis. It's not sexy type stuff, but there's an awful lot of information there to be had. So this is one of our invasive species. This is a rainbow trout. This is non-native, but it's set up residence in the Cuyahoga River. This is, and again, all these pictures are from the Cuyahoga River. These are fish that were taken from within the watershed. This is a muskie up in the Portage Lakes area. Lake trout. Lake were almost extirpated from Lake Erie, but Lake Erie has also made a great comeback, and this one errantly found its way up the Cuyahoga River. Bigmouth buffalo, burbot. And I like this slide because my mentor, Bob Wyszynski, he had the watershed before I did, and he said, you know, Steve, this river has all sorts of potential, but it'll never be a trout stream. So I took this picture and sent it to him and said, you were wrong, Bob, it's a trout stream. here's another public service announcement. There is Matt, one of our interns, holding a northern pike. And if you guys ever get a chance to intern in your chosen field, do it. For somebody that has to look at people to come to work for you, you look at resumes and they just your eyes just gloss over because they all look exactly the same. But when you have somebody that's interned and actually gone out there and done work, it's just an amazing thing, and it really, really, really helps your resume and a chance of getting a job. Nearly all of our interns got a job in the environmental field. Some of them actually came to work for the agency afterwards. The picture you might have seen there with Kelly holding the big fish, she was one of our interns. And even if it doesn't pay very well, which we never paid very well, it's still worth to have in your resume, or even no pay at all, just to volunteer. It's just an incredible experience. Channel catfish. One of the things that we also instituted is a sampling program by our dischargers. So this is the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District are required as part of their discharge permit to have a biologic sampling program for both insects and fish. And we also have lake run rainbows. So the steelhead and salmon, primarily coho, also come up the Cuyahoga River. And this handsome guy is holding a smallmouth bass, which is an area of, stream segment that we did some restoration in as a result of a dam removal. And this just in, the US EPA just released a restriction on fish consumption for the Cuyahoga River. Before, there were an awful lot of polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, primarily PCBs, that contaminated the fish flesh, and so there was a restriction on how much of those fish that you could eat. But that restriction has now gone away, and it's just now the general restrictions on statewide, primarily for mercury, which again comes from our burning of fossil fuels, coal. The air deposition of the mercury is really what's causing a statewide use restriction because of that. And because it's not just the river, or the fish that are benefiting, it's the whole ecosystem. River otters have returned back into the Cuyahoga River, and they're doing wonderfully well. Heron rookeries, there's at least 2 of them within the Cuyahoga River. Bald eagles, not a big deal around here, but when you're from Ohio, that's a big deal. The other thing that's really nice is that back in the 60s and 70s and before then, people turned their back to the river. It was something to be used as a toilet, basically, to dispose of waste. And you just never looked at it. Well, with the improvement in the river, people have turned around, and it's now become the focus for an awful lot of people's activities. There's a lot more whitewater and water recreation. Cleveland has one of the, if not the largest rowing community outside of each coast. And people like to go down to the river just to enjoy the scenery. Believe it or not, there is a national park in between Cleveland and Akron. All sorts of beautiful waterfalls and fall colors. There's a tourist train that rides along the river between Akron and Cleveland. And they have a running commentary about the improvement of the Cuyahoga River. There's a Good Time 3 that takes tourists up and down the river and out into the lake, showing people what's going on. And there's such a demand, there's actually a second boat, the Nautica Queen. Despite that, the river is still used by industry as a transportation route. This is the Manitowoc probably dumping off a load of limestone along the banks. And there's the Wolverine bringing a load of iron ore to the steel mills. And the North Coast is looking pretty good. You don't see that orange stain coming from the river anymore. And that's helped revitalize the city. And every once in a while, they have people come and take a look as to what's going on. So about every other year, the Weather Channel would come out there and interview us about what's going on with the Cuyahoga River. They kind of use it as a touchstone as what's going on with environmental improvement. And there was a movie made. And we had Roger go ahead and do this because he's got a wealth of knowledge about fish. He's got a good speaking voice with a rich, deep baritone, and he's ruggedly handsome. And as they say, I have the face for radio. And But the producer said, never fear, Steve. He says, I'll put you in the film. He says, I'll give you something to do that's commensurate with your knowledge and your expertise. So I get to row the boat. We had, with the success of the Cuyahoga River, people wanted to come around and see what in the heck's going on. How did you guys do this? So we have people from all over the world come over to the Cuyahoga River. People from every continent except Antarctica have come to the Cuyahoga to see what in the heck we've done, to see how we've gone ahead and improved the water quality there. And this is the South Korean contingent that was there with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the background. It was a lot of fun, and it was interesting to see all these cultures, but it got to be a pain in the butt because there were just so many people coming to take your time to see what was going on. And then the penultimate honor, a beer was named after the river. The Great Lakes Brewing Company went ahead and started a business that was based upon sustainability. It was one of the first businesses in Ohio whose business model was on sustainability. And I think that's a perfect end to the slideshow, that a beer company on the banks of the Cuyahoga River was able to go ahead and make a thriving business out of sustainability. And they called the beer the Burning River Pale Ale. Edmund Fitzgerald has nothing to do with the talk. I just likes me my porter. Now I'm on my soapbox. Okay, this is for all you people that still have hair and said hair is not gray. It's real easy to get discouraged with daily news reports of depleted salmon spawning runs, killer whales dying, Tahlequah and her pushing her dead baby around, climate change. It can be very depressing. One of the reasons I want to give the presentation is to give you guys hope that something as bad as the Cuyahoga River, the society can change and can get things back to where it should be. And who knows, maybe someday, when you're old and gray, you'll be looking upon some fresh faces out there, and you'll be given stories about how you were able to combat climate change and take care of some of the other environmental insults that our generation have left for you guys to solve. And I'm pretty sure you can do it. I have confidence in you. So thank you.